when it comes to America and the West, yeah, it wants to build up the EU as a sort of alternative to America, as an alternative relationship. It doesn't like the way that America throws its weight around as it sees it. Doesn't like the what it calls the unipolar hegemony of America in the world order. On the other hand, it also knows that the EU as a if it builds up the EU too much as a sort of united body that has a common view on world affairs as well as on trading issues, then it has two potential challenges, not one. So it has to play that game quite carefully.
So it was quite the charm offensive from Xi. Is it just about driving a wedge between Europe and the US, or is there something bigger at play here in terms of the relationship that China want with Europe?
I think it's to be fair to President Xi and China in general, they have a much more holistic view of international relations than we give them credit for sometimes, and perhaps sometimes than we do ourselves. They think very, very, very carefully about their individual relations with foreign countries and also how that affects their own development process. So their prime concern of the Communist Party has always been for internal stability, the longevity of its own rule, and the economic aspect of that is very important to them. So that means it has to balance two things when it relates to other countries, particularly in Western countries which don't approve of its political system, as most Western countries don't approve of China's political system, which is that it has to maintain its economic relationships with these countries, which means maintaining generally good relations with other countries, while at the same time being very clear that it won't tolerate anything which challenges Communist Party rule, which of course many people in the West want to do because they don't like it. So that is really the overriding way that China handles all foreign relationships. And it does so in a very pragmatic way, which is basically to reward countries that will engage with it economically without making that dependent on human rights issues or other aspects of Chinese policy. But it won't cut off relations with countries that do criticize it because it still needs investment from America. It still needs markets in America and Europe. So the charm offensive is very carefully modulated. So it goes overboard with countries like Serbia and Hungary that say, yes, we want to do business with you. We like the way you operate. We're not going to criticize your internal affairs, your human rights record. It goes completely overboard with them. So you get this incredible, deluge of flattering comments in Chinese media, in from Chinese officials, with France, with EU leaders. It's much more transactional. We know you're going to criticize us. We don't like that. We will hit back. We will say why we don't like you. And yes, if you look as if you're going to take collective action against us, as the EU is threatening to do on trade issues, we will try and undermine that and challenge it in any way we can, including by trying to pick off EU members that that don't necessarily go along with your way of seeing things, like Hungary. When it comes to America and the West, yeah, it wants to build up the EU as a sort of alternative to America, as an alternative relationship. It doesn't like the way that America throws its weight around as it sees it. Doesn't like what it calls the unipolar hegemony of America in the world order. On the other hand, it also knows that the EU, if it builds up the EU too much as a sort of united body that has a common view on world affairs as well as on trading issues, then it has two potential challenges, not one. So it has to play that game quite carefully.
And I mean, I guess with the threat of European sanctions and then kind of the probe that's looking into Chinese subsidies and electric vehicles and everything else that's going on in Europe in relation to China, is this just preemptive damage control?
It's two things really. One is there is a very real practical threat from both Europe and America at the moment on Chinese trade. No doubt about that. If President Trump particularly has threatened incredibly high tariffs, 50-60% against Chinese imports. That will be a severe blow to China. Its biggest, other market, if you like, established market is with the EU. If the EU fears that if all those imports from America are diverted elsewhere, they'll come to EU and swamp European manufacturing. So they're under pressure to match American sanctions. And then two of the big world markets are, much more difficult for Chinese manufacturers, and that has a knock on for the Chinese economy when the Chinese economy isn't doing great and has put a lot of emphasis on high tech exports, higher tech exports like electric vehicles, to sustain its economy. So that's a very real threat that is, playing out in real time this year with the Trump election and this EU investigation into the electric vehicle manufacturing in China. So it's not just preemptive; it's a real ongoing negotiation. It's certainly looking more long term as well at what is the future, what are the parameters of Chinese relations with EU. With the EU and America, in light of all the concerns that are being expressed about security, are we helping the rise of a clear systemic rival by trading with China? And to some extent that's out of China's hands at the now. That's a debate that's happening in London and Brussels and Washington, and there's not much China can do about that because what it's offering the West as a SOP at the moment, investment and trade is precisely what the West fears. So that's that. So there is a preemptive aspect of it, but she has also said, well, there's not much I can do about that, which is why sometimes he appears so sort of quite bullying and forthright. He knows there's not much that he can do about it just by playing nice anymore.
And we know that China have been making kind of infrastructure investments in different parts of the world, including, Africa. And then I wonder, Hungary has kind of faced criticism from the West for its nationalist policies. And they're now seeming to prioritize Chinese investment. Just talk to me a bit about the influence that China is trying to have with countries like Europe and sorry, with countries like Hungary and how that would impact Europe.
Well, that's a very interesting question. The infrastructure. If you want to go into the nitty gritty, the history of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's great vision of using Chinese investment to build trading networks around the world, and in so doing to align countries more closely with Chinese policy. Has undergone a massive shift in the last few years, particularly since the pandemic. A lot of those big projects in the developing world, in Africa and Latin America, haven't necessarily worked out so well. A lot of money was thrown at projects, which some of them have been great for the countries involved. Some of them haven't been so great, and they've all been very expensive. And countries are starting to realize that those were done on commercial lines, very much commercial lines. So those countries are having to pay the debts to the Chinese companies that have built those dams and railways and so on. So those those have been, have been somewhat scaled back. Those big projects, you haven't seen so much of that in recent years. Everyone's waiting to see, how stage one worked out, and it's, some successes but some failures as well. Um, in the last few years, the Chinese projects have been much more strategic, much more closely targeted. Um, for example, countries in Europe which are prepared to challenge the mainstream EU line on China, which means Hungary inside the EU, Serbia just outside the EU, applying to for membership, but that membership is drifting further away precisely as Serbia realizes that China and Russia appear to be friendlier powers to its populist leader. So you are seeing these strategic investments in places like Hungary, but also they're also again commercial and pragmatic, because of course if you build an electric vehicle factory in Hungary, then you're not then included in the tariffs against China production, because the EU tariffs are, because the way the EU operates, are targeted at the actual physical goods, not the companies. So if you're a Chinese company, you're building a electric car in Hungary, or Spain is another country where they're investing in electric car makers. Then your cars are treated just like a VW built in Germany or Poland.
And do you think that she is happy with how his visit's gone? Looked very nice, lots of red carpets and champagne. Overall, did this trip have the outcome he wanted it to?
I think it's made the points he wanted it to make. I mean, there was no breakthrough in terms of no great new agreement that wouldn't be made anyway. But then these visits aren't really meant to achieve things like that, and I don't think he expected that the EU would just fold over and cave on things like its trade investigation on electric vehicles. I think it made the point for I think the reception he received in Serbia and Hungary, which was very flattering, will have boosted his sense that he's doing the right thing by pursuing these relationships outside sort of the core, if you like, of the EU. And I think in Paris, in France, he's devising a new strategy to deal with both the EU and America, in which both sides are, to be fair, of trying to work out parameters where these giant blocks can cooperate to mutual advantage without giving credence to each side's criticisms of the other on strategic and competing issues to do with national security and so on. So I think that there will be a sense on all sides that that sort of negotiated new stage in the relationship is a bit nearer than it was a year ago. That doesn't solve any of the big problems either side is facing, really.
Richard, thank you so much.